Now that we've finished setting up the materials for the project, we can then proceed to add some lights to really liven up our scene. But before we do that, let me just check how our rendering is looking. Right now, our only light source is the HDRI we are using and the light coves. And if we compare it to our inspiration image again, as you can see, there's nothing too special about this lighting. Everything seems to be evenly lit. There's no particularly bright areas, and the shadows are generally where we expect them, under the furniture. So it's good to take note of these things before we start adding the lights, so that we sort of have an idea what type of light we want to use to achieve the look that we want. To add lights in Twinmotion, all we have to do is go to the left-hand side. In the library panel, there's a section for lights. So if you click on that, you'll see all the different type of lights that Twinmotion offers. So basically, there are 6 major types. The first is omnidirectional light, which will throw light in all directions. Second is a spotlight, which is a directional light, and you can rotate this however you want to represent the angle of your light. Next is a projector light, which is basically used for projecting images if you have a projector in your scene. Neon light is usually used for cove lighting like this. As I mentioned before, the standard and lumen rendering style doesn't render cove lights too well. So that's where you may need to use this kind of neon light to represent that cove lighting. And next is area light, which throws light from a rectangular surface like this, and you usually use it for big areas that are evenly lit. And finally, we have IES lights, which are basically like spotlights, but they are using a particular IES profile or the shape of how it throws the light. So as you can see, some are more dramatic than others, and there's a lot to choose from here. And honestly, I've never had the need to load a custom IES profile before. But if you do need to do so, I believe there's an option here under the properties where you are able to load your own IES profile. For this exercise, let's try using an IES light first. So I'm gonna quit out of this media mode first, and I'm gonna zoom into this corner. I'm gonna try to look for an IES light that throws light sort of evenly in a big area. Maybe IES 20 like this. And I'm gonna try my best to put it somewhere in the middle of this light fixture. Like so. And then what I intend to do is later on copy this light to all instances of this light fixture in our ceiling. But before I do that, I'd like to adjust the properties of the light. So the first is the intensity, or how strong the light is. So usually I play around a value of 10 until 50 for this IES lights like this. So I'm gonna try to use 20 first. Let's see how that looks later on. And then for the temperature, since I want this to be somewhat of a daylight color light, I'm gonna use 6000. And very important, under shadows, we always enable this so that it will cast shadows wherever it hits a solid geometry. Some of the other values you can also play around, but basically the important things are the intensity, the color, the shadows, and sometimes the attenuation. So for this case, this ceiling is around 3 meters if I remember correctly. So attenuation is basically how far the light throws itself. So 3.5 I think is good enough. It's good enough to reach the floor. So let me just check how that looks now. So it's okay. We don't see the effect too much right now. Now what I'm gonna try to do is to copy this light to the other instances of it on the ceiling. But before I do that, what I usually do is I consult the Revit model to see exactly how far each light is from each other. So here I've conveniently dimensioned it already, so I know the distance between these lights is 1175 mm, and to the other side it's 1800. So I'm gonna copy this 1800 to the right side first. So all you have to do, let me try to adjust it more to be in the center. Like this. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but try to get it as close as possible to the center. And then to copy, all we need to do is hold the shift key on your keyboard and hover over this red axis so that it's restricted to that axis when you copy. So hover over it first, then select with your left mouse button and drag it to the right. Never mind the distance that appears here, because we can always set the actual distance later on after you release everything. So once you release, this dialog will appear. I'm going to type 1.8 here, 1.8 meters. And basically we have two options when we copy. Instance will create an instance of the original thing we copied. That means every time I change the value for one of those elements, it will reflect those changes across all the instances. Whereas when we use the copy option, it will just create a copy of that light, and then I can adjust the intensity, for example, of this new light without affecting the original light. But in this case, I want all these lights to be the same value, so I'm gonna use instance. And I know these two lights are exactly 1.8 meters apart. Now I'm gonna copy both lights across to the other instances. I have them both selected. By the way, if you're not seeing the icon, you may have accidentally pressed G on your keyboard. That toggles the visibility of those icons. So G is the shortcut. So if I want to select two instances, I just have to control select or hold your control on your keyboard and select those items on the viewport. Alternatively, you can always select it to the scene graph here. So if I control select or shift select, that works also. That will select all the instances I want. And then same thing, I'm gonna hold the shift key and I'm gonna hover over the green axis this time because I want to go to this direction. Hover over it, then select and drag it to the right. And this time, I want 4 instances, and I know the spacing is 1.175. And then I press OK. So that copies that light across to the other instances of the light fixture. Once I'm okay, I can just right click to deselect everything, and I'm gonna check the effect here in our preview of our rendering. I'm gonna press R to check how that's looking. So that's actually pretty okay, but in this case, rather than using different IES lights, since the area should be evenly lit, the more appropriate light to use in this case is an area light. Before I replace the IES lights we used with an area light, let me just demonstrate some of the cool features here in Twinmotion that makes it such a powerful software. So let me just quit out of this media mode. And by the way, if you're not seeing the icons for the lights, try pressing the G key on your keyboard. That toggles the visibility of these icons. So earlier, remember when we copied these lights, we copied it as an instance. So let me just demonstrate what I meant by that. So if I change this value for this particular light, the intensity value to 10, notice how the other light instances also change its value to 10. So that's how it keeps that relationship. So I'm gonna bring it back to 20. But if I actually want to change the value for this particular light only, I can always break the instance of that particular light. So all you have to do is right click on it here in the scene graph, and then you have an option to break instance. So once you break an instance, you cannot go back anymore. So if I change this to 50, you'll see that the other instances are not affected anymore. So they remain at 20. But I can always undo that if I still want to keep that instance relationship. Okay? So that's one. Another cool feature is, if I'm not happy with the IES light I used, I can always select them here in the scene graph and not delete them, but replace them. So if you right click again, here in the scene graph, there's an option to replace object. And here I'm able to use a different IES light. For example, I want something more dramatic like this one, IES 21. I can just drag and drop this to this box and click Start Replacement. So that replaces all the selected objects I selected here in the scene graph. But if you do this, you'll have to change the values again because it will go back to the default values for the light. So I just need to change this to 20 again, make the temperature 6000 again, and enable shadows. So let me just check how that looks if I use that particular IES light. So it's more dramatic, but the throw of the light is not that spread out. So that's how you can experiment with different IES lights. Although the IES lights look very nice, for our particular rendering, I think we should use an area light instead. Because if you consult the inspiration image again, we're trying to achieve more of an evenly lit scene. I'm gonna delete these lights. Also take note, IES lights take more or use more resources because, like for this case, you need 10 of them to represent each and every light fixture, whereas an area light, you just need to use one of it and it will cast the light for the entire area of the room. So what I'm doing here is I'm just gonna try to place it somewhat in the center of this room. And actually, if you hover over this yellow icon in the middle, that will place it wherever you release your mouse. Alternatively, you can also use this and drag it to wherever you need. You hover over this area, and if you hover over the red axis only, it will restrict you to that axis. And if you hover over the green axis, it will restrict you to that particular axis. So in this case, I just like to place it here. Before I adjust the properties of the light, what I usually do is I go back to my Revit file and just consult the general area of the room. So I know the width is 5160 and the length is around 8.2 meters. So take note of these values, because the size of our area light doesn't have to be exactly this. It has to be actually lesser by around 400 or 500 mm, so that we don't see the harsh outline of the light casting on the walls. So in this case, the width is 5160. So let's make it around 4.5. So you see that the harsh shadow line doesn't appear on the wall too much anymore. And for the length, instead of 8.1, let's do something around 7.5. So that's good enough. Then for the intensity, it doesn't have to be too strong. Let's start with 50 first. And then the color temperature around 6000. Attenuation, we can keep it at 5 as long as it's reaching the floor. But later on, if it's still too dark, we can always increase the attenuation. And then the most important thing, we also have to turn on shadows as always. So let's go back to our preview image. And right away you can see it's looking nice, it's evenly lit. And I think the value of 50 is right on the money. We don't need to change it. So this is good enough.